when I get a chance to attend the AU summit, which sits in Ethiopia, I have only one question to ask the members who have been sitting there before.
What question?
What have you been discussing for so long? What have you been talking about for so long? To the extent that some African countries are still fighting each other up to now. Yes, what have they been talking?
What discussing?
Yes.
What you just heard from that young boy is a question that should echo in the heart of every true African. What has the African Union really been doing all these years? What's come of all the countless discussions, the summits, the promises? Time and time again, we hear about African leaders gathering for yet another summit. They discuss, take pictures, release statements, and then nothing. Is that not cause for deep concern? The African Union is meant to be the pinnacle of unity in Africa, the collective voice of the continent, fighting for the interests of its people. Yet today, it stands largely irrelevant, a toothless bulldog, as Patrice Lumumba once so aptly put it. The African Union has failed in its most crucial missions, to combat neocolonialism, to protect Africa from the predatory interests of the West. In fact, some might argue that, far from standing against Western influence, the African Union has, in many ways, enabled it. Where are the bold actions? Where is the unity and strength that was promised? It's time to ask, has the African Union become a silent partner in Africa's continued subjugation? The reason the African Union has become a shadow of its former self can be traced back to one key issue: a lack of revolutionary patriotic leadership. Gone are the days when Africa had leaders who were willing to fight tooth and nail for the continent's freedom and sovereignty. The problem runs deeper. There's no unity among the member nations. Despite the African Union's founding mission to promote peace, progress, and unity across Africa, it's evident that this vision has been left unrealized. And if we trace the roots of this failure, we find ourselves looking back to 1963, the year the Organization of African Unity, OAU, was formed. In Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the founding fathers of Africa came together with one major question on their minds: what's next after independence? But there was a critical divide on the table. Should Africa accept the arbitrary borders imposed by colonial powers at the Berlin Conference? Or should they redraw them to reflect Africa's natural and cultural landscapes? This was more than just a matter of geography. It was a matter of identity. On one side, you had Kwame Nkrumah, the visionary president of Ghana, advocating for a united Africa, a continental federation, a union of African states with a single diplomatic corps, a shared defense system, and a unified market. This was a call for Pan-Africanism, a call for unity stronger than any division. But this wasn't a singular voice. Muammar Gaddafi, long before his tragic fall at the hands of the US and France, echoed the same vision. Africa must unite not just in name, but in action, as one powerful force on the world stage. Imagine what might have been if that vision had been fully realized. But instead, Africa was left divided, and the African Union today bears the weight of those missed opportunities. Imagine if Kwame Nkrumah's vision of a united Africa had been fully realized, where Africa would stand as one powerful, cohesive force on the world stage. Just picture it, the entire continent working together for its collective interests, free from external influence and united in purpose. How different would Africa be today? But unfortunately, Kwame's Pan-African dream was dismissed by the majority of the founding fathers. The reason? Sovereignty. The other presidents didn't want to give up control over their individual countries. They didn't want to sacrifice their authority. So, instead of moving forward with Nkrumah's call for a united Africa, they settled for something far less ambitious. A modeled framework based on the Organization of American States, which resulted in the formation of the OAU, Organization of African Unity, in May 1963. The OAU was intended to be an intergovernmental organization that would unite African nations, but with one significant flaw. Its charter pledged that it would not interfere in the internal affairs of its member states, even in the face of massacres. Sovereignty, once again, was prioritized over the moral responsibility to protect the people. On the surface, this might have seemed like a fair approach, one that safeguarded the power of each individual country. But this was the beginning of Africa's undoing. This model, founded on the preservation of sovereignty at all costs, would set the tone for decades to come. African nations, for the first time, began to mirror the very systems of governance imposed on them by their colonial masters. From their political systems to their languages, even their traditions, everything was borrowed. Instead of forging their own path, Africa took on the characteristics of its former colonizers, a disaster waiting to happen. John Henry Clark saw this coming. He predicted that Africa's inability to break free from the shackles of colonial influence would lead to its downfall. And tragically, his warnings have come to pass. John Henry Clark warned that once African countries regained their independence, they would continue to operate under borrowed systems of governance imposed by colonial powers, systems that were never designed for Africa's unique challenges or needs. He was absolutely right. The current state of Africa is a living testament to the failure of these foreign systems. Despite the passage of time, Africa has yet to escape the grip of these borrowed frameworks. The tragedy? Africa refuses to let go of these systems. Why? Because whenever challenges arise, whether political, economic, or social, Africa instinctively looks outward, searching for answers in the West, as if the solutions to its problems can only come from foreign lands. Take the ongoing crisis in the DRC as a prime example. For years, the DRC has been a hotbed of instability, with millions of lives lost and millions more displaced. The situation has reached catastrophic proportions. Yet what has the African Union done? Talk and talk. Empty rhetoric and broken promises, but no action. The African Union should have been the first line of defense, but instead, it has watched idly, allowing the West to dictate how the crisis should be handled. The questions are hard to ignore. Why isn't the African Union stepping up? Why is Africa looking for solutions from the very powers that have historically exploited it? The African Union was created to protect and serve Africa's interests, but it has become a symbol of inaction, failing when Africa needs it most. As we discussed earlier, the roots of Africa's failure to tackle its own challenges lie in the decision made by the OAU not to interfere in the internal affairs of its member states. This decision, while perhaps well-intentioned at the time, has left individual African nations to grapple with their problems on their own. The DRC, the Sahel, Sudan, all of these regions have been abandoned to fend for themselves in the face of escalating insecurity. And when things became too overwhelming, they once again had to turn to the West for help. This has become a recurring pattern. Africa's challenges are routinely handed off to the West to resolve. But how can Africa ever hope to regain sovereignty under these conditions? How can the continent stand strong when its problems are continually solved by outside powers? Take the situation in Sudan as a textbook example. In 2023, just 9 days after the deadly conflict began, the Sudanese armed forces and the rival Rapid Support Forces agreed to a 72-hour ceasefire, but not through any initiative by the African Union. No, this breakthrough came after 2 days of intense negotiations led by the United States and Saudi Arabia, not Africa. Let that sink in. It wasn't the African Union that stepped up to mediate and broker peace in one of its member states. It was the US and Saudi Arabia. Why? Why did the AU, the supposed representative of Africa's collective sovereignty, fail to take charge of such an important diplomatic moment? Instead of showing leadership, the African Union allowed external powers to dominate the conversation and once again dictate the terms of the peace process. How can Africa reclaim its sovereignty when it constantly looks outward for solutions? In a statement heralding the much-needed nationwide ceasefire, then U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged the warring parties in Sudan to immediately and fully uphold the ceasefire. He also emphasized that the United States will coordinate with regional and international partners to secure a permanent peace agreement. True to his word, just 2 days later, Blinken had a phone conversation with the former African Union Commission chairperson Moussa Faki discussing ending the fighting in Sudan. In an official statement, Blinken noted that he and Faki had agreed that the AU's continued leadership remains essential in urging both the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces to cease military operations and allow for unhindered humanitarian access. On the surface, Blinken's words seem to elevate the role of African leadership, emphasizing its importance in the peace process. But let's not be fooled by the diplomatic pleasantries. The situation was painfully clear. An African nation was engulfed in deadly conflict. And once again, the United States, the very embodiment of neocolonialism, was at the helm of the global response. In the face of a crisis unfolding within Africa's own borders, African leaders and diplomats were reduced to mere background actors and commentators, with little to no real influence or agency. Their voices, once meant to represent the continent, were drowned out by the voices of external powers, leaving the African Union to watch as outsiders took control of a crisis it should have owned from the start. This was the bitter truth. Africa was sidelined while the West took center stage. Sure, there were some African efforts, at least on paper, to address the violence. Comoros president and current AU chairman Azali Assoumani claimed to have held phone conversations with SAF head General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and RSF leader General Mohamed Hamdan Hemedti Dagalo on April 23rd and April 25th, respectively. On April 28th, the African Union published a statement in which Assoumani described his discussions with the two generals as rich, constructive, and promising. He urged the international community to support the African Union's efforts to restore peace and stability in Sudan. But it was all the typical talk with no action. As expected, these so-called promising conversations yielded no meaningful results. The extension of the April 24th ceasefire, which was supposed to be a critical moment in the peace process, wasn't brokered by any AU official or African leader. Once again, it was the US and Saudi Arabia that secured the deal, leaving the African Union out of the picture. When the Saudi-US facilitated talks resumed in Jeddah on May 6th, there was no mention of the African Union's supposedly pivotal leadership. The AU, left to follow the negotiations from the sidelines, tried to insert itself into the conversation by issuing a statement that reaffirmed the imperative of the ceasefire in Sudan and called for respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Yet, as the negotiations continued, the AU was once again absent from the key agreements. The Jeddah Declaration of Commitment to Protect the Civilians of Sudan, signed on May 11th, made no mention of the African Union or any African power for that matter. In short, as the Sudan crisis unfolded, African diplomats were overshadowed and relegated to nothing more than loquacious spectators, with the US and its allies leading the charge while the AU watched from the sidelines. Africa's voice was once again drowned out by the very forces that have historically dictated the continent's fate. Far from taking charge and leading a meaningful intervention, the African Union has done little more than release generic soundbites and express hollow concern for the well-being of Sudanese civilians. It's been more than 2 years since the conflict erupted in Khartoum, and yet the African Union, the supposed vanguard of Africa's interests, has failed to convene an emergency heads of state meeting to address this deadly crisis. Meanwhile, many African leaders somehow found the time to attend the coronation of King Charles III in London on May 6, 2023, and numerous other irrelevant international events. Priorities? It seems the African Union's leaders are more preoccupied with international pageantry than with the lives of millions of Sudanese caught in a deadly conflict. The United Nations and international aid agencies have raised alarms about the well-being of thousands of Sudanese refugees fleeing into Chad to escape the violence. Yet, African leaders have yet to present any comprehensive plan to assist these refugees or address the crisis in the wider region. But here's the kicker. The same US that has dominated peace talks for Sudan and continues to sideline the AU was once again at the forefront of negotiating a peace deal between the DRC and Rwanda. The African Union, yet again, was absent. Instead, it stood by and watched as Donald Trump orchestrated the meeting between two key African leaders. After the deal was signed, the AU had the audacity to congratulate the US on its achievement. This is deeply troubling. The fact that the US can eclipse the African Union at such a crucial moment in the history of both Sudan and the DRC raises alarming questions about the AU's ability to lead and protect Africa's sovereignty. More importantly, it forces us to confront the critical question: what happened to the idea of African solutions to African problems? The AU was supposed to be the answer, the body capable of uniting and mobilizing Africa's nations to address the crises within its own borders. Instead, it has become little more than a spectator, incapable of stepping into the breach. Africa's problems demand African solutions, but the African Union has proven time and again that it is neither equipped nor willing to step up when it matters most. In October 2001, speaking to a joint session of parliament in Cape Town, former South African President Thabo Mbeki set the tone for Africa's future, stating, "We are agreed that we must strengthen democracy on the continent. We must entrench a human rights culture. We must end existing conflicts and prevent new conflicts." Less than a year later, in July 2002, after the African Union was established, African leaders pledged to reject external interventions, particularly from powers like the US, and instead promised to implement African solutions to African problems. Yet, barely a year after these ambitious declarations, war broke out in Darfur, Sudan, between the Sudanese government and rebel groups. Over the next few years, the conflict claimed 300,000 lives and displaced over 2.5 million people. In a desperate attempt to suppress the rebellion against his regime, Omar al-Bashir, the Sudanese president, recruited the Janjaweed militias, which would later evolve into the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. He not only funded these militias, but also granted them immunity from prosecution. By 2009, the International Criminal Court, ICC, indicted al-Bashir for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes committed in Darfur, based on overwhelming evidence of mass atrocities carried out by government forces and the Janjaweed paramilitaries. But here's where it gets especially troubling. In an attempt to protect African solutions and African sovereignty, the African Union stood in the way of international justice. Rather than support efforts to hold al-Bashir accountable, the AU refused to cooperate with the ICC, choosing to shield a man responsible for genocide from facing trial. This move, intended to protect Africa's autonomy, not only undermined justice but also sent a chilling message that African lives and human rights were secondary to the continent's self-interest. In trying to protect African sovereignty, the AU's refusal to back justice for Darfur was a flawed and damaging decision. It stood in stark contrast to the very principles of human rights, democracy, and peace that Mbeki had once championed. Instead of leading by example and ensuring that Africa confronted its own crimes, the AU chose to shield a dictator, abandoning its moral responsibility to the people of Sudan and, by extension, to the entire continent. The African Union went even further in its defense of Omar al-Bashir by advising its member states to ignore the ICC's warrant for his arrest. The AU claimed that the ICC was unfairly targeting African leaders, positioning al-Bashir as a victim of international bias. It argued that his lawful arrest would jeopardize efforts to achieve peace in Darfur and South Sudan. But this line of reasoning was deeply flawed and ultimately detrimental. In addition to these imprudent and unwarranted anti-ICC actions, the AU endorsed a sham presidential election in April 2015, an election that saw al-Bashir win 94% of the vote amid widespread opposition boycotts. The AU, rather than condemning the undemocratic process, praised it as the expression of the will of the voters of Sudan. This was an endorsement of a dictatorship masquerading as democracy. In 2019, after years of tyranny, the RSF and the Sudanese army conspired to finally oust al-Bashir from power, following widespread protests against his 30-year despotic rule. Despite this moment of hope for the people of Sudan, the African Union still failed to act in a manner consistent with its constitutive act, which emphasizes international cooperation and respect for international law. The AU, which was supposed to champion the people of Sudan, instead chose to turn a blind eye to the gross violations that had been taking place under al-Bashir's rule. Even more troubling is the AU's disregard for basic democratic norms and the values enshrined in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. It had no problem mollycoddling a ruthless dictator and suspected war criminal like al-Bashir, giving him the protection he needed to avoid justice for years on end. The African Union repeatedly claimed to be a dynamic, people-centered Pan-African organization, but its actions painted a different picture. The AU didn't just stand by as al-Bashir remained in power. It actively contributed to fostering a dangerous military complex in Sudan, one that hindered progress, perpetuated instability, and stifled democracy. In the end, the AU's stance on Sudan reveals just how far the organization has strayed from its founding principles. Instead of leading the continent towards justice and human rights, it has become an enabler of oppression and a protector of autocratic rule. Progressive African interventions and solutions should always prioritize democracy, good governance, and human rights, without fear or favor. These interventions should focus on the well-being of the people, not the interests of foreign powers with ulterior motives and conflicting agendas. African solutions to African problems should always come first, not as an afterthought or in reaction to external pressures. But for far too long, the African Union has stood by as illiberal regimes like al-Bashir's festered in places like Sudan. It has remained idle in the face of immense human suffering, allowing dictatorships and corruption to thrive under its watch. Enough is enough. Sudan is in Africa. The DRC is in Africa. The Sahel is in Africa. These are not remote, troubled outposts belonging to the West. These are African lands, with African people struggling to live with dignity and peace. The responsibility for resolving these crises lies with Africans, not with the West. It's high time the African Union lives up to its own declarations and fulfills its expansive mandate to bring peace, justice, and unity to the continent. If the AU cannot do this, then it should be scrambled, dismantled, or completely restructured, because the people of Africa deserve a body that will act on their behalf, not just speak on their behalf. What do you think? Let's win the comments section below and start a conversation about how we can demand the leadership and action we deserve. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analysis and discussions.